Good morning, live from Paris. Well, after a closely fought election, the results in the end was not as close as some people were predicting. Emmanuel Macron is now the first president in 20 years to win a second term, after seeing off the challenge from his far-right opponent, Marine Le Pen. He's made a promise to unite his country, which, in his words, is riddled with doubts and divisions. But as the news filtered through of his win, hundreds of people took to the streets to protest in at least 6 French cities. The riot police were out here in the capital. Here's the results. Well, the election result gives Macron a 58.54% of the vote, while Marine Le Pen has 41.46%. Sky's Adam Parsons reports now from Paris.
In the end, the president won this race with remarkable ease. A walk in the park, but one that came after a fight.
Our country is full of doubts and full of divisions. So we will have to be strong. And no one will be left by the wayside.
This was not a euphoric speech. There was no triumphalism. He thanked his opponents and looked forward to the future.
Emmanuel Macron's often been accused of being aloof and elitist and more interested in the European Union than he is in his own country. But this is a celebration of Frenchness. We've had the national anthem, there are endless flags, and it's all in front of the Eiffel Tower. This is Macron saying to his people that after this overwhelming victory, he wants to be the president for each and every one of them.
For the people who came to spectate, relief, but not really jubilation.
I vote for the first two, but not for the second, because I want either president.
He reminded everyone that the values of democracy and the French Republic were more important.
Marine Le Pen supporters had gathered in hope of a close finish, but as soon as the exit polls appeared, the game was up. 5 years ago, she was demolished in the presidential runoff. This time, it was nearer, but still the gap was wide. She seemed unrepentant.
So tonight, I'm worried that the next 5 years I hope that they won't be the same as before. And I hope that Emmanuel Macron will try to repair these splits in our country.
Macron enjoyed the feeling of victory and the party that followed, but he knows that many people voted for him simply to stop Le Pen, rather than because of their faith in his leadership. And that sense of discontent reverberated across France as the result was announced. In towns across the country and here in Paris, anti-Macron protests led to violent clashes with police. In June, France will hold parliamentary elections, and in those, he may be bruised. Macron knows that even in victory, his country remains fractured. Adam Parsons, Sky News, Paris.
Well, we can talk now to our correspondent, Ali Fortescue, who is also in Paris. And it feels, Ali, doesn't it, that the scale of the victory is obviously emphatic, but at the same time, there's an awful lot of people who are unhappy with the results, the minority of whom, of course, taken to the streets.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, France today waking up to another 5 years of Emmanuel Macron, but waking up too to those really unsettling images of protests across France. Hundreds of people gathered in Paris, most notably at Place de la République, where we saw riot police, tear gas being used to break up protesters. We've seen hundreds of people protesting too in places like Marseille, in Nantes, in Lyon, where people were chanting, ni Macron, ni Le Pen, neither Macron nor Le Pen. And that has been the sort of theme of this election in many ways, an unpopularity contest and a lot of votes that weren't even cast, people who abstained because they didn't want to vote for Emmanuel Macron or Marine Le Pen. The challenge for Macron now is going to be healing those wounds. We heard him yesterday, I think, sounding more humble than he was 5 years ago, saying that he wants to be a president for all people. But clearly, these were two people that didn't just have small policy differences, they had completely different visions for France. He knows that the challenge now is going to be bringing this country together.
Thank you very much, Ali Forsky there in Paris. And it does feel like that is the story of the election, really, an emphatic victory for Emmanuel Macron, but underneath that, of course, deep divisions remaining, many people unhappy with that final runoff. Well, that's all from us in Paris for now. Right back to you in the studio, Neil.
Sophie, thanks very much indeed. Let's take you straight to Kyiv, where we have been hearing from the US Secretary of State. More money has been handed out to the Ukrainians. Let's find out what's going on.
Continue to do to ensure that we get them as much assistance as possible, as quickly as possible. So our focus in the meeting was to talk about those things that would enable us to win the current fight and also build for tomorrow. And again, a very productive discussion. We talked about security force assistance, and we talked about training, and we also talked about the key things that we're going to discuss in the session that I'll conduct tomorrow at Ramstein with a number of ministers of defense and chiefs of defense. This session is focused on doing things to generate additional capability and capacity for the Ukrainian forces. And so it's a great opportunity to get a good update from the Chad and from the Minister of Defense and from the President on the things that they are focused on, the things that they need. That'll enable us to have a more productive discussion with the Chads and Ministers of Defense tomorrow.
Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken, I'm just
that, of course, SecDef, not the Secretary of State. We'll listen, check the tape and see what we've had from Antony Blinken, bring it to you just a little bit later on in the programme. But let's return to domestic politics. And joining us in the studio once again, Minister for Technology and the Digital Economy, Chris Philp. Lovely to see you this morning, Minister.
Good morning.
Can we start, if possible, with France and President Macron's re-election? Has there been a collective sigh of relief breathed in Whitehall at this news?
Well, I mean, the UK government is always ready to work with governments of other countries once they're elected. We obviously congratulate President Macron on his victory and look forward to, working closely with him. I think the situation in Russia, Ukraine and elsewhere in the world, I think where there are, dangerous and uncertain forces at work, demonstrates the importance of European democracies and free countries around the world working closely together. And I think, we look forward to doing that with President Macron as he forms his new administration.
I think, however, there will be a number of people in Europe, this side of the Channel and on the other, somewhat concerned about Marine Le Pen and the strength of the polling that she enjoyed. Yep, she has made her kind of brand of far-right politics somewhat more palatable, but that 2 in 5 of those who went to the polls in the French presidential election voted for her must be of some concern.
Well, I think across Western democracies, it's important that leaders listen. I think electorates across the Western world, in America, across Europe, have concerns about issues like cost of living, like immigration, and it's important that elected governments listen to those concerns and respond to them. And that applies, in many different countries. But as I say, look, as far as the French election is concerned, we're looking forward to working with President Macron to meet the global challenges that we, as free Western countries, face together.
For once in all of our chats, let's actually talk about something on your brief, shall we? And the government now moving forward with the Tracy Crouch review, putting fans at the centre of football once again. Just tell us just a little bit more about it.
Yeah, well, the government committed in its 2019 election manifesto to have a fan-led review. That was set up about a year ago, and it was led by Tracy Crouch, a Conservative MP and former sport minister. She spoke to, I think, hundreds, possibly even thousands of fans up and down the country. She made a number of recommendations. She had 10 strategic recommendations, which we're accepting. But important amongst those was the idea that we need to have a statutory football regulator, so a regulator set up in law by an Act of Parliament, because football clubs are critical parts of our local community. I'm a Member of Parliament in Croydon in South London. Crystal Palace is our local club, and it is a really important part of our local community. I went to my first game there with my dad in 1991. I took my son to the semi-final a week or two ago, which unfortunately we lost.
I wasn't going to mention it.
We're going to the home game against Watford at Selhurst Park in a couple of weeks. So it's something which I think, is intergenerational. Like, families do this together. It's part of a local community. So when a club goes bankrupt and potentially disappears, as Bury and Macclesfield have done, Derby County obviously is in all kinds of difficulties at the moment, and other clubs have come very close. That is something which really affects the heart of communities. It makes a football club different to a normal business, and that's why this regulator, statutory regulator, will make sure that football clubs are in a financially healthy position and owners don't get into the position where they kind of gamble recklessly with the club's financial future by spending way, way too much, more than they can afford, and putting the club's future into jeopardy, as happened in those cases that I just mentioned.
I think a number of people, though, will be very intrigued by the owners and directors test that is also going to be brought in. I mean, it's a very topical issue. We all know that the sale of Chelsea is going through at the moment. Can we just be clear? Would that apply retrospectively to whoever takes over at Chelsea FC?
Well, the intention behind the new test, which would be administered by the regulator rather than by the football authorities, as at the moment, so it's a transfer of responsibility for doing that test, would apply not just at the point of takeover, but it would also apply from time to time on an ongoing basis as well. The details are going to be set out by my colleague, the Sport Minister, in Parliament later on today, but it will be an ongoing test, not a one-time test, and it'll be wider than the current one. So it'll look at questions of integrity, financial resources, capability and capacity, those kind of questions, to make sure that people who are taking on custodianship of such an important cultural asset like a football club are the people that are going to handle it properly.
Can we talk about the political story of the weekend? And it, of course, involves Angela Rayner and that article in the Mail on Sunday. When you read what was written by the Mail on Sunday's political editor, what was your response?
I was appalled. I was appalled that that sentiment was being expressed. It's offensive. It's misogynistic. The Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers have been absolutely right to roundly condemn that sentiment and to offer support to Angela Rayner on this issue. I've never heard anyone say anything like that or even hint at it. And if I did, I would be disgusted and appalled. Nobody should have to suffer the kind of misogynistic abuse which that sentiment amounts to.
Can I take it from what you've said then, that the whips will be finding out who said it and disciplining them accordingly?
Well, I think if it ever comes out who said that, then I imagine they would be subject to discipline, yeah.
Yeah, but the reason I ask is that as things stand, we have had a couple of tweets sent by the Prime Minister. We understand that a WhatsApp message was sent. But, you know, there is a story, of course, in all of this. The story is that 5 of your colleagues, or a number of your colleagues, chose to brief against an incredibly senior female Labour politician in some of the most, as you yourself say, misogynistic terms. So, again, I'll ask, does this not demand an internal investigation by the whips, by the party?
Well, I think they'll be looking at whether they know who said this. I've got no idea who said it. And I say no one has ever said anything like that to me or even hinted at it. And I think everybody is appalled by the misogynistic sentiment. I think we all need to keep the tone of discourse in public life kind of civil and respectful and focus on the issues that our constituents expect us to deal with, not engage in this kind of what essentially is abuse.
The reason I ask if there is more to be done is, to be fair, at the weekend, the kind of Conservative Party's commitment to sorting this mess out didn't really appear terribly strong. I want to show our viewers that which the Prime Minister tweeted in response to the article. And, you know, when you read the words, they are pretty strong. As much as I disagree with Angela Rayner on almost every political issue, I respect her as a parliamentarian and deplore the misogyny directed at her anonymously today. Very, very strong, you would say. And then we saw this from Nadine Dorries. As much as I disagree with the exact same tweet. What's going on here?
Well, I mean, they share the same view. They're colleagues in government.
They share the same view to the word.
Yeah, I mean, look, Nadine is my boss, and she feels very strongly about the place of women in politics and that this sort of abuse is unacceptable. I'm sure she'll have discussed it with the Prime Minister. They'll have reached the same view, and they've used the same words. There's nothing surprising that 2 colleagues in government have exactly the same view and use the same words.
There is nothing surprising about 2 human beings sitting down at a keyboard and tapping out exactly the same sentence construction.
They've got the same view on this issue.
Honestly, you're trying to maintain that the Culture Secretary didn't copy and paste this.
Well,
This wasn't something that was sent to her. These aren't her own words. They're clearly not her own words because they were said by the Prime Minister 15 minutes before.
Look, I mean, I've heard Nadine talk about this kind of issue in private quite a lot. And I can tell you the sentiments being expressed there are sentiments I've heard her express countless times over the last 9 months that I've worked with her. So it doesn't surprise me at all that she's expressing herself so strongly, but nor does it surprise me that she and the Prime Minister are saying exactly the same thing. If they were saying different things, you'd be asking me about that, wouldn't you?
I would, but I wouldn't be asking you about this if she'd used slightly different words. You know, it is clearly not her own thoughts. Well, she may think that, but she's chosen to copy it directly from the Prime Minister. The reason I ask is, of course, we are in an election cycle which looks like it could be, well, is it fair to say these local elections could be pretty challenging for the Conservatives?
Well, I think local elections, mid-term, tend to be challenging for any government, where, you know, of both colours. If you look back over the history of the last 20 or 30 years, mid-term local elections always pose challenges. But very often they also reflect local conditions. So, again, we've got local elections in Croydon, the borough that I represent. The Labour council there has gone bankrupt because the first London borough to go bankrupt in 25 years because they engaged in reckless property speculation. They bought a hotel that then went bust. Those sort of local issues, I think, do play a very important role as well.
But the national issues clearly play a part in all of this as well. I mean, we're reading Stephen Swinford in The Times this morning, quoting a senior official who's seen the Sue Gray report, who says it is so damning that the Prime Minister may go as a result. I mean, you know, Conservatives are pretty happy that Sue Gray isn't reporting this side of the election.
Well, I'm not going to speculate about what this report may or may not say. We'll obviously, I'm sure, debate it very amply when it gets published. But as I say, I've been out and about in Croydon this weekend, all day yesterday, for example, and people are focused rightly on local issues. We're electing local councils to run local authorities, and the issues people are focusing on are which party, who is best to run your local council. In the case of Croydon, the appalling, bankrupt Labour administration, I think deserves to be voted out, and I hope they will be.
But it's not just the electorate that perhaps are going to give the Conservatives a bit of a kicking at the moment. I mean, last week, the government tried to delay the investigation, the Privileges Committee investigation. I mean, were you given a call by the Chief Whip? I mean, did the Chief Whip say to you that he wanted you to vote to delay that? I mean, what was your response to that?
Well, I think there was obviously a bit of a debate that went on about whether the debate was over whether the vote, it's all a bit technical, over whether the vote to refer to the Privileges Committee should have happened last week, or whether the vote should have happened after the police investigations and the Sue Gray report had concluded. That was the debate. It's a rather technical, nuanced debate.
It's not really that technical. On the one hand, you had the government wanting the amendment, putting forward an amendment, to delay the investigation, which they then pulled half an hour before the vote.
Yeah, well, it was just a debate about when to have the vote, and they decided that since the Prime Minister felt he had nothing to hide and doesn't mind even more scrutiny. This will be, by the way, the third investigation. You've got the police one, the Sue Gray one, now this one is the third one. He said he had nothing to hide and therefore doesn't mind Parliament performing whatever scrutiny that it wants to. So they just got on with it and had the vote last Thursday, which, as it turned out, wasn't a vote at all. It was completely uncontested and not a single person voted against it. So it turned out to be a non-controversy.
Chris Phil, good to have you in the studio this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We are now going to return to the border of Poland and Ukraine. Listen to, I think, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken.
Austin and I just returned from Kyiv, where we went at the request of President Biden and the invitation of President Zelensky. We had an opportunity to demonstrate directly our strong support, our strong ongoing support for the Ukrainian government and for the Ukrainian people. This was, in our judgment, an important moment to be there, an important moment for Ukraine, for the war, an important moment to have face-to-face conversations in detail about the extraordinary support that we provided, security, economic, humanitarian, as well as the massive pressure that we've been exerting on Russia, and then to talk in detail about how we carry that forward across all of those fronts. I would say that without putting words in his mouth, President Zelensky expressed deep appreciation for President Biden's leadership and for the incredible generosity and support of the American people. In turn, we expressed deep admiration for his leadership, for the extraordinary courage of Ukrainians in standing up to and pushing back this Russian aggression. Part of our commitment going forward involves a number of things that I was able to share with President Zelensky yesterday, including the return of American diplomats to Ukraine starting next week, including President Biden's intent to nominate a new ambassador to Ukraine, Ambassador Bridget Brink, currently an ambassador, someone I've served with for a long time, deeply experienced in the region, who'll be a very strong representative for the United States in Ukraine. We had an opportunity as well to talk about where this goes from here. With the success that Ukraine has had, it's also true that Russia continues to try to brutalize parts of the country. And the death and destruction that we continue to see is horrific. But Ukrainians are standing up, they're standing strong, and they're doing that with the support that we have coordinated from literally around the world. The strategy that we've put in place, massive support for Ukraine, massive pressure against Russia, solidarity with more than 30 countries engaged in these efforts, is having real results. And we're seeing that when it comes to Russia's war aims, Russia is failing, Ukraine is succeeding. Russia has sought.
Our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, is live in the Ukrainian capital for us. Morning again, Deborah. What do you make of that which we heard from Antony Blinken? I mean, the Ukrainians are crying out for assistance. They've been crying out for assistance since the start of this. Indeed, they've been crying out for assistance since long before conflict started.
Yes, and they are getting that assistance. And the fact is, the Ukrainian military was able to defend Kyiv in the way that they did, prevent Russian forces from seizing the capital, in large part thanks to the weapons they received from allies like the US, like the UK and others. But of course, as the Secretary of State and the Defence Secretary were spelling out, they're still giving their press conference now, actually, the requirement from the Ukrainian side is evolving as the war evolves. So Russia has changed its strategy. It's moved its forces out from the north of Ukraine, and it's now focusing in the east. In the north, there's a lot of forestry. The terrain is very different. In the east, it's open plains, and that's why the need now is for tanks, for heavy artillery, for long-range guns. He talks about the howitzers, which are being very well received here in Ukraine, and also the need to sustain this support. On Tuesday, the US Defence Secretary is going to be hosting a meeting in Germany on an airbase there, where other allies are going to be meeting with him, talking about the continued support that they need to give to Ukraine.
Deborah, thanks very much indeed. Now, the Health Secretary has said a hormone replacement therapy czar will be appointed, as shortages of medication have reportedly left some women feeling suicidal. The announcement comes as recent figures suggest the number of HRT prescriptions in the UK has doubled in the last 5 years. But stocks, well, those are running low. Our reporter Madeleine Ratcliffe joins us from the newsroom now with more on this. Madeleine, explain exactly why we are in such a problem with getting hold of this HRT medication and what indeed a czar can do about it.
Well, the shortages have come for several reasons. First of all, there's a global increase in demand for the drugs. They're patches or gels or pills even that help combat some of the very varied symptoms when you're going through the menopause. So it's no wonder that they're popular. But increased global demand. And then, of course, we've heard so much about supply chain problems. It affects these drugs as well. We know that there have been manufacturing issues that then meet still some kinks in the supply chain. Some of the biggest manufacturers of the gels have said that they've had shortages and have been struggling to get enough of the stuff. And then at a local level, that meets sort of differences between local health authorities, what they offer. Some have offer fewer HRT options. And so across the board, that leads to what we've had, women sharing their prescriptions, struggling to get enough of it. The shortages, we think, have been going on the last few weeks into a month or so. Now, what does ARCAN do? Sajid Javid hopes, or says the role will be modelled on Kate Bingham's incredibly successful chairing of the vaccine task force. So obviously, that helped get the vaccine rolled out across the UK incredibly quickly, was widely seen as one of the great successes of the pandemic. And the idea is similar to that, so it will be someone who can oversee the supply chain on a macro level and then all the way down to a more local level, make sure all those bits work together, make sure the money is going to the right areas in terms of research and innovation. So we can only hope it will be as successful as Kate Bingham's chairing of the vaccine task force.
Madeleine, thanks very much indeed. Now, there are growing concerns that the Chinese government could order the capital, Beijing, into lockdown to try and contain an outbreak of COVID. It comes as Shanghai reports 51 new deaths among its COVID patients. Let's speak to Sky's Asia correspondent, Tom Cheshire, who is in Beijing for us, and for the time being at least outside. There must be plenty of concern there, given what we have seen in Shanghai, as to what might be coming down the pipeline for Beijing.
Yeah, Neil, people are very worried here, and the reason they're worried is because of what's happening behind me now. This is mass testing. So there have been about 19 cases in Chaoyang district, which is the district where lots of people live, 3.5 million people live. They all have to go and get tested. Now, the line today is 9 in the morning, local time. Still lines here. And because this is what happened in Shanghai to start with, people are worried. In Shanghai, they said they're going to mass test people, and then since then, they've been in lockdown the entire time. And there has been about the same thing happening here. If you go to supermarkets, the shelves are all empty. The government has said there are enough food, aren't based on what they saw in Shanghai, because Shanghai now entering the 5th week of lockdown. As you say, 51 deaths reported. That's the highest in a day since the early days of the Wuhan outbreak. The most concerning thing, though, is that cases there are still around 20,000 a day. So they have been going up, but they're not coming down. So the idea of the lockdown ending soon, I don't think that is going to happen. So people in Beijing worried about the same fate. Now, the corollary to that is perhaps we've seen other cities in China, like Shenzhen, mini lockdowns, short, sharp lockdowns, and they've done it when case numbers are slower, and as a result have been able to come out of them quicker. So a lot of people think that's what's going to happen here. Wait for cases. Impossible situation that Shanghai has seen. Try and get on top of this quickly and lock down quickly. It's clear that when you test 3.5 million people, you are going to find a lot more cases. I think anything more than 100 would precipitate some sort of lockdown in this area. And the question then becomes, how long does it last? Is there enough food for everyone? And the bigger question, is this the right strategy long term? COVID zero, dynamic COVID zero, as China calls it. It hasn't vaccinated much of its elderly population compared to other countries, so it's still relying on lockdowns more than 2.5 years into the pandemic.
Tom, for now, many thanks indeed. Let's take a look at some of the day's other headlines now. And a cross-party group of MPs have criticised COVID travel restrictions as disproportionate to the risks to public health. In a wide-ranging and highly critical report, Westminster's Transport Select Committee say that the government's travel rules caused a severe financial shock to the sector without significant health benefits. We'll be chatting to the chair of that committee a little later in the programme. Police have arrested a man in his 50s in connection with the disappearance of a woman in Burnley. 33-year-old Katie Kenyon has not been seen by her family since last Friday, when she's believed to have left an address on the town's Todmorden Road. An outbreak of Ebola has been declared in the Democratic Republic of Congo 4 months after the last one ended. The World Health Organization says it is the 3rd outbreak in the northwestern province since 2018. So far, only 1 case has been confirmed. At least 1 person has died and 3 firefighters have been injured by wildfires in the US state of Nebraska. The wind-driven wildfires have also destroyed hundreds of structures in northern New Mexico and forced thousands to flee. You want to have a look at this. Stagecoach. They are road testing the UK's first fully autonomous bus, as you can see written there. The vehicles are equipped with sensors which enable them to run on pre-selected roads without the driver having to take control. How can he stand sitting at the wheel with his hands by his side? Well, they hope to carry passengers over the Forth Road Bridge from Fife to Edinburgh by the summer. Will you be on board? I'm not so sure. Let's have a quick look at the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
And the week ahead is looking mostly dry with sunny spells and light winds. However, it will be on the cool side with a return of nighttime frosts. Largely dry but chilly first thing this morning with a touch of frost in sheltered parts of the north and west. Low cloud in the northeast will burn back to the coast this morning to leave sunny spells, but scattered showers will develop through the day. Temperatures, those will be down a notch, although it will feel warm enough in the sunshine with lighter winds than of late.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Welcome back. Just a reminder as to our top stories this morning. And Emmanuel Macron has won a second term as president, beating his far-right challenger, Marine Le Pen, but protests have broken out in cities across France as the president sets out to heal a divided nation. The US has pledged more money for Ukraine's military after a meeting between America's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and President Zelensky. And the government has outlined new plans to give football fans more of a say in how their clubs are run. Now, MPs across the political divide have condemned an article in the Mail on Sunday about Labour's deputy leader, and they've condemned it as sexist and misogynistic. Well, earlier I asked the Technology Minister, Chris Philp, about the story, which claimed Miss Rayner had been distracting Boris Johnson at Prime Minister's questions by crossing and uncrossing her legs. He told me that he was appalled.
I was appalled that that sentiment was being expressed. It's offensive, it's misogynistic. The Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers have been absolutely right to roundly condemn that sentiment and to offer support to Angela Rayner on this issue. I've never heard anyone say anything like that or even hint at it. And if I did, I would be disgusted and appalled. Nobody should have to suffer the kind of misogynistic abuse which that sentiment amounts to.
As you can see, our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, is here in the studio. Morning, Tamara. It's appalling, it's misogynistic, but aside from a WhatsApp message and a couple of fairly identical-looking tweets, I mean, what are the government doing about this?
It's pretty clear that Number 10 feel that this is all they are going to do about it. It's been pointed out to me that Boris Johnson contacted Angela Rayner personally on WhatsApp yesterday. I'm told he sent her a short but heartfelt message and that she graciously replied. Although I've not been told exactly what was in the message, other than him saying it was not in his name. This was not something that he was putting about by any means. It's also been pointed out to me by another friend of the Prime Minister that he was very angry about his wife being referred to as Princess Nut in some other briefings to newspapers by his former advisors about a year and a half ago. So the idea being that he takes misogyny quite seriously and quite personally and conveyed that to Angela Rayner. But as far as Number 10 is concerned, he's condemned it. It's been condemned by Conservatives pretty roundly, and that is the end of it. When you ask Chris Philp whether there'd be an internal inquiry or anything, he called it abuse, but he said they would be going no further. In terms of an attempt to get the journalists to have their pass revoked from Parliament, I don't think Labour or the Conservatives support that on free speech grounds. It's a matter of taste, really.
Tamara, for now, thanks very much indeed. Let's head back to Sophie. She's in Paris and has all the latest on the French election results. Interesting night, Sophie.
Yeah, it certainly was an interesting night, and really the margin for victory bigger than many had expected, but that does mask, I think, some divisions in the country. And Emmanuel Macron has vowed to unite what he sees as a divided France after becoming the first French president in 20 years to be re-elected. He saw off, of course, that challenge from the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen to get a second term. Now, the election results give Macron 58.54% of the vote, while Marine Le Pen has 41.46%. And Mr Macron has already been congratulated by other world leaders, including Boris Johnson, the Dutch Prime Minister, and also the President of the European Commission, while his supporters gathered in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower to celebrate and hear him address the crowds. Well, with me now is our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons. It feels like before we get to the caveats, it's right to acknowledge the scale of the victory.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think both of those things are right, Sophie. I mean, a 17 percentage point victory in a two-horse race is very wide. I've just been looking at the figures. It's the third biggest victory ever. The worst ever was Jean-Marie Le Pen. The second worst was Marine Le Pen 5 years ago, and now we have this one. So Emmanuel Macron won by this yawning margin, and it's a bigger margin than any of the polls have predicted. And interesting, over the past week or so, at one point it was well into single digits, and it's got wider and wider. It feels like in the past week something happened. There are a lot of French voters sat back, looked at these two candidates and thought, do I really love either of them? Probably not. But which one do I dislike less? And it appears that the one that they thought was the safer, more palatable option was Emmanuel Macron. But as you said, this is This is not an election where people are out on the streets jubilant, celebrating, you know, the returning hero. It is very much the case, as we heard a lot of times in the campaign, of a choice between cholera and the plague, and in the end, they went to Macron.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adam. We'll have a quick look at some of the papers and have a look at how some of those French papers are actually covering President Macron's win. Well, this is Le Figaro, which splashes with a triumphant President Macron, calling his victory historic. Their headline, "Big Victory, Big Challenges." Libération asks who Mr Macron has to thank for his re-election, suggesting that it's mainly due to a protest vote against the far right. But Le Monde is a bit more muted. They lead their website saying it was a victory without triumph, overshadowed by the record performance by the far right. Well, Macron's supporters were celebrating his victory last night. As you can see there, a victory that was really quite muted in some ways. He was much more of a humble sense, I think, compared to the victory that he had back in 2017, and perhaps an acknowledgement there from Mr Macron that there were people who supported his policies, but he was also elected to power by those who effectively lent him their votes to, in his words, act as a barrier to the far right. So an emphatic victory, but with some caveats. Turnout the lowest that it's been since 1969, which I think perhaps gives you a sense about some of the unpopularity of the two candidates in the final runoff. Well, with me now is the National Rally's candidate, I shouldn't say candidate, councillor, Patricia Chagnon. Thank you very much for being with us today. Disappointing night for you.
It's of course always a disappointment. You don't enter an election to lose, right? You enter an election to win. But the defeat yesterday really actually hides a great victory because never so many people voted for Marine Le Pen. There were 17 million voters for our party yesterday in France. I think it's very important to realize that the abstention rate was tremendously high in France. 16 million people did not go to the polls, and there were another 2 million who actually cast blank votes for this election. I think the result that we see from this election yesterday is a new division in French society. We definitely have now, on the one hand, Mr Macron, his globalist view of the world, who was voted in by urban people, a lot of the quartiers, the banlieue, as we say in France, where Mr Mélenchon voted, but we might get back to that. And we see that Marine Le Pen has consolidated her votes in rural France and amongst the young generation, which is very interesting because the young generation, of course, is upcoming, while we see that Mr Macron got the votes of the 65 plus, which of course is a generation which is outgoing.
I just want to come back to what you said at the beginning, saying that you lost, but it was actually a great victory. I mean, that seems almost quite Orwellian to me. I mean, if you look at the results, you got absolutely trounced. Macron got 58.5% compared to 41.5%. In what land is that a great victory?
We nearly gained 10% back from 2017. So the idea
is... So you lost, but slightly less badly. That's not a victory, is it?
No, it's 10% more. That's huge. That is absolutely huge. If you see the difference between 2017 and 2022, and it's nearly a 10% gain in voters.
But that's also partly because of the unpopularity of Macron. You said yourself the abstention rate was extremely high. This is a man who's seen as arrogant as the president of the rich, and yet he's still managed to trounce Marine Le Pen.
Yeah, I don't think that's the only reason for the abstention. I think the reason for the abstention is that we did not have a proper presidential debate. Mr Macron only entered the campaign very late. He waited until the last day to declare his candidacy, and he only had one single debate. He refused to participate in the national debates with the 12 candidates. And I think a lot of people were left very disappointed because there was no proper presidential debate about two very different projects for France, and they decided not to go because there was no presidential debate. So I think that the abstention rate shows the disappointment, the disapproval, maybe even the disgust of the French people with French politics, as you know.
Including the far-right candidate?
I'm saying general politics in general, because we have a two-tier system for voting for the presidential elections. We have a two-tier system voting very shortly for our National Assembly. And that means, for example, that in 2017, with over 40% of the votes, Rassemblement National has 7 members of parliament in France. I mean, that is crazy, right? So that disappoints a lot of people, and I think this election shows that it's really time to start changing the electoral system in France, have a more proportional system, so the French people feel involved in politics.
Let's talk a bit about those elections, because as you said, they're coming up in June, aren't they? It's going to be a big focus for lots of the parties. How hopeful are you that the right, the far right, are going to get seats in the National Assembly?
Oh, it's going to be a very interesting battle. I think that the vote that was cast yesterday, if you look at the media in the 2 weeks prior to the second round, I did not see one newspaper asking to vote for Marine Le Pen, although I saw many newspapers clearly saying we must vote Macron. So I think what's going to happen now in the elections, the General Assembly elections will be in June. I think the French people are going to want a proper opposition. They don't want Macron to call out the yellow vests again in the street. They want more protection. So I think the French people will vote in their members of parliament in a very different way.
And what next for the far right? Marine Le Pen this is her third attempt at the presidency. Is it time for her to step back and allow new faces to come forward?
I think the question is, of course, we are going to sit down, everybody is going to sit down and discuss the results of the elections and analyse them. As I said before, I find great joy in when I look at the numbers of young people that voted for us. Marine Le Pen really just had the best scores with the young people of France, and that's very encouraging. It does mean that the young generation wants to change.
We also change, but not necessarily the far right. You know, I do have to come back. This is an election where you're 41.5% of the vote against an unpopular president. Many people would see this as a rejection of the far right and the policies of the far right. Yes, there has been some incremental change, but overall, this is a far worse result than you're expecting.
Sophie, you do not live in France, in rural France, where I come from and where I'm elected. There is a great division in France between people who live in urban areas, like in Paris, who can afford, apartments with 20,000, 30,000 euros a square metre, and the rest of France, who have to get by on a minimum wage, which is the majority of the French people. People who are living and working in the countryside, where the petrol prices have exploded, where the public transport has gone, where there is no more health care, where sometimes you have to travel for an hour to see a GP. Those people have voted massively for Marine Le Pen. If you see the French countryside voted massively. So as I told you before, what this election really teaches us is there is a great division between urban France and rural France. A huge division. So I understand where you're coming from. But of course, rural France is not so populated, so the impact of voters in cities is very high. And it's in
there's more people.
Yes, of course, there's more people. But we have seen on the voting maps that it's big urban areas with wealthy people who've benefited from globalization, but also the banlieue, where of course Mr. Mélenchon, who you're not talking about, but who's the third runner-up, extreme left in France, woke left, Trotskyist left.
Who also did much better than expected in the first round.
Yes, he was the great surprise of this election. He was actually the great surprise of this election. And he got the majority of his votes in the suburbs, what we call the hot suburbs, where we have all those problems with drugs, immigration, crime, organised crime.
Okay, thank you very much. We are out of time there. Great victory for the far right, according to our Patricia Champion. Well, that is all from us for now in Paris. Emphatic victory for Emmanuel Macron, but as we said, the lowest turnout since 1969, perhaps revealing a bit of dissatisfaction with both the candidates in the final runoff. Back to you now, Neil.
Sophie, thank you. Lots more, of course, from Paris throughout the day. But let's change direction somewhat. And Netflix, remember them? Well, they're axing their own original shows much earlier than scheduled in reaction to their sudden loss of subscribers. Fans are furious over the cull, as fewer than 1 in 5 Netflix originals are reaching their third season. Let's have a look at some of them.
If it pleases your greatness, you may take my son.
Father, what are you doing? Father.
Margaret, this will not be forever.
The walls of my kingdom stretch beyond the horizon.
Report what you see.
Shoot on sight.
My pleasure.
Well, joining us to discuss, the tech journalist Will Guyett, live from his tech shed, as always. Good to see you this morning, Will.
Good morning.
If you'd read the papers this weekend, you would have assumed that Netflix was entirely on its uppers, that it was on its way out, that it had already died a death. I suspect we're being a little premature. What's your view?
Yeah, I think people are being slightly premature because Netflix were the first, and they're the first to make this huge pivot. The reality is there's too many streaming services. And if you don't have product or shows that people want to watch on those services, people soon turn off because it's either get a Netflix subscription or eat in some people's cases. So there's a cost of living situation going on here. And I also think, probably from my view, and I've got the arcade machines behind me, I don't necessarily think that Netflix has made the greatest views on what its programming are. It's trying to broaden its audience at the moment. It's trying to move away from the people like me who love the Adam Sandler films. And that's an important stat because they invested millions of dollars in Adam Sandler because they knew their viewers were watching Adam Sandler films. We were all questioning why they were doing it, but it was because they have all the statistics about who was watching what and when they were watching it. So they're very savvy at deciding what comes and what goes, perhaps much quicker than other broadcasters because they're getting all of this instant feedback.
Yeah, but you say all of that, OK? They've got the access to the instant data. They have access to more money than God. I mean, they spent tens of billions over the past couple of years to get the programmes out there, and still they're shedding subscribers.
Yeah, and that's the cost of living versus the cost of streaming. It's one of the first things that goes because you don't have a long subscription. The reality is, 5 years ago, I had a Sky subscription, and I may have had one other streaming subscription then. Now, in 2022, I've got at least 5 streaming subscriptions alongside my Sky subscription, and the cost of viewing has not stayed in line. You're now paying an additional amount of money for all of these services, and I think that's the challenge here is none of them have yet reached the sweet spot. Netflix has this incredible habit of increasing the price. When I started watching Netflix, I think I was paying £5 a month. I think it's now about £15 a month. So there's this increasing cost. And the other thing that's been largely unspoken about with Netflix till now, and they're now speaking about it, is the number of people sharing a password. They say they're now in 220 million homes where they have subscribers, but they've also now admitted they've got 100 million people watching subscriptions twice. So they may have 300 million people watching, but only 200 million people globally are paying. And this is going to be the next big issue. Everybody who's been lending in quotation marks a password to other people are going to find soon they're going to be locked out.
Well, you've got 30 seconds, but, we're already hearing from Netflix that they're talking about perhaps moving to a lower individual cost model, but with some advertising. I mean, I don't know about you, but that sounds an awful lot like television.
That's an awful idea. I'd sooner sit and watch a film on any other channel where you don't get that disruption. Netflix are also moving into video gaming as well, which shows you perhaps that streaming of films and TV content might not be the only place where they want to be.
Well, always good to see you, and indeed, Batman. You might want to stay tuned for a couple of stories later on in the show. For now, thanks very much. Let's have a quick look at a couple of the picture stories. In the Telegraph, a Picasso painting owned by the late Sean Connery. Why on earth do you think I went for this story? Well, it's set to fetch a massive £15 million when it comes up at auction. The former 007 has a philanthropic fund in his name, so some of the money raised from this painting will be donated to its charities. And in perhaps some of the most bizarre news you'll hear today, The Sun has an image of a woman who has married her cat. The happy couple, oh God alive, tied the knot in order to prevent landlords asking her to get rid of the feline, a true tale of true love. And love is clearly in the air, as back with the Telegraph, they have a picture of 2 newlyweds who took part in the Malden mud race in Essex yesterday. I'm hoping their honeymoon will involve a shower and possibly a dry cleaner. We will see you at 8 o'clock when we'll have all the latest from Paris as Emmanuel Macron wins another term.